So you hear this all the time, right? Companies and organizations proudly talking about their commitment to climate action, aligning with big goals like SDG 13. But what does that actually mean when the rubber hits the road? Today, we're going to get into how you move beyond just promises and press releases to build a real, measurable system for dealing with climate risk. And it all starts by asking one really important question.
This right here, this is the whole game. It forces us to get honest. Are our efforts just about creating a good story for the annual report, or are we building an organization that can actually withstand what's coming? It's the difference between a narrative and genuine governance. And that distinction, well, that's what we're going to unpack today.
So let's start by breaking this down. Why isn't just taking action enough? What does it really mean to govern climate risk? And here's the core idea. Without data, without hard numbers, climate action is just a story. It's a story we tell ourselves, we tell our stakeholders, we tell our customers. And look, it feels good, but it doesn't actually prepare us. Real governance needs measurement. Why? Because what gets measured gets managed. Simple as that. We're all familiar with Sustainable Development Goal 13. It calls for all the right stuff, being resilient, adapting, cutting emissions. But here's the crucial part. These goals are just words on a page until they are plugged directly into an organization's core risk systems. That's the moment they stop being aspirational and start being operational. And this quote just nails the mindset shift we all need to make. For decades, climate was kind of filed away under corporate social responsibility. A nice to have, something to buff up the company's reputation. Well, that era is completely over. Climate change is now a fundamental systemic risk that can threaten everything from supply chains to assets to financial stability. It belongs in the office of the Chief Risk Officer, not just the marketing department. Okay, so if we're going to manage it as a risk, we have to define it first. What does climate risk actually mean? It's not just one big, scary thing. It really breaks down into two very distinct categories. So on one side, you've got physical risk. This is the stuff you literally see on the news. The direct punch from a changing climate. It's the hurricane that shuts down your supply chain or the flood that damages your factory. Then, on the other side, you've got transition risk. Now, this is the risk that's created by our reaction to climate change. Think new carbon taxes, sudden policy changes, or investors yanking their money out of carbon-heavy industries. Both of these can be absolutely devastating to a business that isn't ready. All right, so we've defined the risks. Now for the most important part. How do we turn all this knowledge into an actual, concrete strategy? Well, that's where a solid measurement framework comes in. It's the bridge from knowing to doing. The path from risk to resilience is actually a pretty logical chain of events. You start by identifying the specific climate risk you're facing. Then, and this is key, you have to put a number on it. That's your quantified exposure. Only then can you build a smart mitigation strategy. And to see if that strategy is even working, you need a measurable KPI. Finally, to make sure everyone's accountable, it all has to report up to executive oversight. See? Each step builds on the last. This is how you make those steps real. So for physical risk, a metric might be, what percentage of our revenue comes from regions that are super exposed to extreme weather? For transition risk, you could measure your carbon intensity for every widget you produce. And for the financial risk, you can use something called Climate Value at Risk, or VAR. Basically, VAR is a model that tries to estimate the biggest financial loss you could face from climate issues in a certain time frame. It puts a real dollar amount on the line, and that is a language every boardroom understands. This all sounds great in a presentation, right? But does it actually work in the real world? Let's take a quick look at a case study of a company that made the leap from just talking about climate to actively governing their risk. So here's our company, a mid-sized industrial player. Their big problem? They were located in a coastal zone, which made them super vulnerable. And they weren't just facing vague threats. They were staring down specific, measurable risks, like rising sea levels, a higher chance of flooding, and energy costs that were all over the map. So what do? They put the framework into action. They ran models to see what different climate futures could look like. They figured out exactly which of their assets were most exposed. They started measuring their carbon intensity and, this is huge, they started reporting all of it directly to the board. This wasn't a side project CSR report. This was a core governance meeting. And the results? They started to roll in. First up, an 18% reduction in their energy intensity. I mean, that's not just a win for the environment. That's a direct operational improvement that saves money and cuts risk. A total win-win. And they didn't stop there.
Next, they pulled off a 12% reduction in their overall carbon exposure. This wasn't just a promise in a report. This was a clear, measurable number that proved their strategy was working and that they were becoming more resilient. But here's the real kicker, the thing that gets everyone's attention. Because they could clearly show how they were managing their risk, their ESG rating went up. And what does that lead to? A lower cost of financing. The banks and investors saw them as a safer bet and rewarded them with cheaper capital. That is the financial payoff of doing this right.
That case study just sets up our final point perfectly. This isn't just about managing operations anymore. We're talking about a fundamental shift in how the financial markets value companies.
You know, climate risk metrics aren't some abstract idea for the future. They are actively changing the game right now. They're influencing your cost of capital, your credit rating, the price you pay for insurance, and whether or not investors want to buy your stock. It's all connected. Which really brings us to this critical, simple truth. If you don't have the metrics, it doesn't mean you don't have the risk. It just means you have a hidden liability lurking on your books. And if there's one thing financial markets hate, it's a risk they can't see and can't measure. Inaction itself has become a huge financial liability.
So it all boils down to this simple but incredibly powerful governance loop. Step 1, identify your unique climate risks. Step 2, design the right metrics to actually track them. And step 3, constantly monitor how you're doing and report that progress right up to the top. This is the basic architecture for building a resilient organization. We've absolutely crossed a threshold here. Talking about climate action has officially moved out of the realm of just environmental rhetoric and landed squarely in the middle of financial stability and fiduciary duty. This is now a fundamental governance responsibility for any serious leader. Which brings us to the final choice, really, for every leader out there. The shocks are coming, that much is certain. The only real question is this: will your organization be one that measures its risk and adapts ahead of time? Or will it be one that just keeps reporting on its good intentions and is forced to absorb the full, unmitigated impact when it arrives? The choice is yours.